Welcome, everyone. My name is Todd Federman. I teach economics at the Feliciano School of Business at Montclair State University. With me today is
David Axelrod. I also teach economics in the economics department at Feliciano School of Business at Montclair State University.
All right, today our discussion is about the Build Back Better plan, which is a spending plan which has passed the House of Representatives and now is going to be considered by the Senate. There's been a lot of conversation about it. So let's start our conversation. David, why don't you just tell us a little thumbnail about what the plan is?
Okay, so Build Back Better, it's useful to keep in mind that this is different than the infrastructure plan that was recently passed, which tended to focus on things like roads, water systems, sort of the hardware, so to speak, of the economy.
And let me just interject, also the infrastructure plan, very much spending money on infrastructure for broadband access in rural areas.
Especially, yes, that's especially going to be a boon for people that are deep in rural areas, yes.
Okay, so let's get back to Build Back Better. How is it different?
So the difference here is instead of focusing on that type of physical infrastructure, it's going to start addressing several important things. One, some things to deal with climate change, universal pre-K, child tax credits, 4 weeks paid leave for parents, increase in healthcare spending, and some money for affordable home care and affordable housing.
All right, before we get in, we're going to take a look at all those individual points and discuss how we think they're going to impact the economy. But before we do, there's been a lot of discussion about the price tag for this bill. And Republicans obviously making a lot of noise about the whole price tag. So what is the price tag for the bill estimated right now? And let's see if we can put that in perspective.
So we're looking at about 1.7 to 1.8 trillion, but that's over 10 years.
Right.
And that's an important thing to keep in mind, because now you're only talking about 175 to maybe $200 billion a year. And I know you have some thoughts on that.
Well, I mean, exactly. A lot of people don't understand the whole concept. GDP is gross domestic product. It's the total value of final goods and services in this country. It's estimated next year to be in the ballpark of $24 trillion. So the total amount of goods and services, which is also very much the income of the country. When you have a $25,000 car, that translates into $25,000 worth of wages and profits, which are like the wages of the owners. So we think of GDP as not just the goods and services, but the income of the country. Spending an additional $200 billion when the economy is $24 trillion, that's less than a 1% addition per year to the economy. So it doesn't sound like an awful lot of additional spending relative to the size of the entire economy. But one of the things we're going to think about now in the individual items in the bill, do we think it's going to add to inflationary pressures? Because that's certainly something that people are thinking about now. Recently, over the last 6 months, we've seen inflation as measured by the Consumer Price Index in the ballpark of 6%. And people are starting to notice it, not just filling up the car with gas, a lot of different food items and things. So we're going to talk about the individual items in the bill. Do we think they're going to add to inflationary pressures? Do we think they're going to add to the economy in terms of generating more jobs? So let's get started. Let's start with item number one, money to fight climate change. Dave, roughly how much do we think is in the bill?
The estimate is about $555 billion for climate-related provisions. Actually, most of it is in the form of tax credits, somewhere around $320 billion for things like installing solar panels on your rooftop, improving energy efficiency in building, and purchasing electric vehicles.
David, let me interrupt here for a minute. Let me explain for the audience the difference between the tax credit and the tax deduction. A tax deduction, what most people are more familiar with, let's say you have, before the tax law was changed and when there was actually a deduction for state and local income taxes, if you had a large tax bill to the state, you could take that bill and reduce your income and then calculate your taxes. That's not how a tax credit works. Tax credits for an electric vehicle, let's say it's $5,000. You figure out your tax bill, and then because you bought a car, you get to subtract $5,000 from your taxes. It's not a reduction of your income. It's much more important. It's a reduction of your tax bill. So this is very significant. It will definitely drive a lot of purchases of electric vehicles. So David, a couple of questions now. What do we think this is going to do in terms of impacting the economy, in terms of GDP and jobs? And what do we think about inflation on this?
Okay, well, first of all, it's going to provide significant financial incentives for manufacturing clean energy technology. And we need to move in that direction. You know, all the developed nations, even China, is moving in that direction because, like it or not, we've got to change. And so that's one thing. The other thing is that there is a potential for hundreds of thousands of new jobs. For example, just dealing with restoring forests and wetlands. Now, for those that are sort of like, well, who cares? You know, things like wetlands are one of the things that protect the shore, for example, along the Gulf Coast from damages from hurricanes and other extreme weather events. So this has the potential of helping to save money in the long run that insurance companies don't want to have to pay.
Right. And also, I mean, all the amount of jobs as part of this for fighting climate change, besides tax credit for cars, all the money going to be spent restoring forests. Again, those forests are going to, besides generating the jobs for all the people who are going to be, working in restoring the forests, and clearly helping the environment because forests suck up a lot of the carbon dioxide in the air. It's estimated this will produce hundreds of thousands of jobs, which will increase spending. So no question, it'll be a boost to GDP. But again, all that additional spending on those jobs could be could put a little more inflationary pressure on things. But again, 300,000 jobs when you've got relative to a workforce of about 150 million, again, maybe the additional spending generated by these jobs might be a little inflationary, but oh my God, it's probably minuscule. Okay,
Yeah,
David, go ahead.
Yes. So one thing about calculating inflation, right, is it's important to keep in mind that if we don't handle some of the climate change issues, and with it issues around pollution, the cost for the lifestyle that we have now is going to go up anyhow, because it'll be more expensive for insurance. Right. Instead of having cheap water, you're going to have to spend a lot of money on getting clean water.
Right.
So we have to keep that in mind as well.
One of the things some people might have heard, because a lot of people follow Elon Musk, he came out the other day and he was kind of skeptical on this portion of the bill, tax credits for electric vehicles, which makes you kind of like scratch your head. But when you really get into the nitty gritty, one of the items in the law that's, again, passed the House but hasn't passed the Senate yet, is that the tax credits will actually be larger if the electric vehicle was built in a union shop, and Tesla is not a union shop. So definitely a very strongly partisan item there that the Democrats put in to try and promote higher paying union jobs. So when Musk sounded a little skeptical, I think he was a little skeptical more about the extra tax credit for a union created electric vehicle.
Yeah. Okay,
let's move on to the second item in the bill, which is $400 billion for universal pre-K. Okay. How do we think that's going to impact let's start with the supply of labor.
Okay, well, before we quite get to that, let's be clear about what's going to happen. If you have a family with annual income of less than 300K, which is the vast majority of families, vast majority, you will pay no more than 7% of income on childcare for children under 6. Now, this is really very significant, especially for low-wage earners. The challenge around this is that some economic thinkers will see this as household consumption. On the other hand, this actually is going to make it easier for low-wage earners to go to work, because if you actually have to pay for childcare, pre-K, that can eat up so much of your salary, it's not worthwhile going to work. So this will be actually a support for people to have greater labor supply. Now, with that in mind, if it helps to increase labor supply, that will dampen any kind of inflationary pressures. Because
why is that?
Because the supply of labor increases. If the supply of labor increases, it tends to dampen wages and salaries. But that's okay, because people are getting the pre-K, so they don't have to spend as much. And then if that dampens any kind of growth in wages and salaries, that helps to keep the price of the finished products from going up faster in price.
Well, one of the things also I want to interject right here, $400 billion for universal pre-K will clearly clear up the ability for lots of people, hundreds of thousands of stay-at-home moms and dads, to go back to work. And to follow up on everything that you said, roughly, and it's a rough thumbnail, 50% of the cost of anything is labor, give or take. Some percentages it's less, some it's more. On average, it's roughly half, give or take. Okay. We need labor. Every single story you read about now about all of the backlogs and the shortages that are occurring, okay, in the supply chain, the main backlog is labor. And again, a lot of that is COVID related. Maybe people have been skeptical about going into the workplace. But if we put an incentive for people to go back to work, that means we'll be able to expand production. That means we'll be able to start increasing the supply of goods. That means we will cut down on the backlog and the shortages that are rampant throughout all different kinds of industries. And when you increase the supply on an aggregate basis, it clearly should have downward pressure on prices. Clearly, this to me looks like a win-win. We'll have more people working, and we'll be able to produce more goods. And definitely from an aggregate demand and aggregate supply analysis, it seems like it really should help to free up aggregate supply.
Yeah, and one other important thing here. If you're going to spend money on education, the earlier on is better, because you get multiplier effects in terms of kids being prepared to move up. So having more pre-K available will not only free up some families to be able to, parents to go to work, but it is likely to increase the productivity of young children now when they enter the labor market in about 20 years. So this is going to have a very long run benefit, which again, if it increases productivity, that will tend to increase supply, and that will tend to dampen any kind of inflationary pressures in the very long run.
Okay. All right, let's move on to item number 3. We believe there's about $200 billion set aside for child tax credits. So Dave, can you explain how this works and why it's extremely significant for very low income families in America?
Yes. So as it's currently written, for each child under 6 that a family has, they'll get $300 per month. So that's up to $3,600 a year, and $250 per month for each child 6 through 17. So that's about $3,000. Now, this is set up for the next year. So it's not being planned at this point to be continued over and over and over again. Obviously, if it turns out to be very popular, maybe it'll get renewed, but it's for the first year. the reason why it's so important for people with low incomes is because it's a big chunk of their salaries. Now, it does turn out that if you have such low income that you have no tax liability, you won't necessarily get that benefit from it. So they have a provision where if you can't take the full amount of credit this year, it'll be passed on to the next year.
Excellent. All right, now, it sounds like giving money to poor people, which is what it is, right? We have
That's
children.
the intent, yep.
Okay, but now let's think about it in terms of impact on the economy. Aggregate demand, aggregate supply. It seems like these are the kinds of families who will be spending that money on basic goods and services. And as a result, no question, be an addition in terms of the amount of consumption spending by households. So expanding the economy in terms of the amount of goods and services, creating more jobs for the people who are providing those goods and services. But perhaps when you increase aggregate demand, perhaps this might have slight inflationary, put up some slight inflationary pressure on things.
Yeah, I would imagine this would have some inflationary pressures. Again, it's a chunk, but it's still a relatively small percentage of the total GDP for the economy.
Okay, next up is $200 billion for 4 weeks of paid leave. Apparently, the United States is basically one of the only advanced countries in the world that doesn't have something like this. So this will be direct money. I'm not exactly sure how this is going to work. Dave, do you understand how these payments would work?
To be honest, I'm not quite sure if this is going to be direct payments or if it's going to be payments to the employers to provide it.
Right, but either way, it's not going to cost the companies. Either the money's going to go to the companies and the companies will give it to the people or go directly to the people.
Correct.
So as an impact to the economy, again, this is just putting more money in people's pockets, but it's going to be in lieu of pay that they were going to get, right? Because I think we're talking about a leave from your work, and then you're going to get money from this program. I'm not sure if there's anything more than that here.
Well, just to keep in mind, one, you don't necessarily get 100% of the base income. Depending on your income, it'll be up to 90% of the base income. So if you have low income, you'll probably get about 90%. If you have higher income, you'll get a lower percentage. The one other thing to keep in mind is this program isn't scheduled to start until 2024. So we wouldn't see this benefit for a couple of years.
Right. And I believe I read something that Senator Joe Manchin from West Virginia specifically said he'd like to carve this out of the bill and discuss it separately.
Yes, yes.
Okay. All right. Next up is $165 billion on healthcare spending, reducing Affordable Care Act premiums. Clearly, something like this looks like it's going to put money back into the pockets of lower income Americans who have a much higher propensity to spend, right? What does that mean? The lower your income, the more likely is that you spend it, okay? Taylor Swift and LeBron James don't spend all their income. They make tons of money. Someone making $25,000, $35,000, $45,000 a year, after you take away taxes and other deductions, for Social Security and Medicare, by the time you get done, they're spending 100% of their income on rent and food. Give them a cut on their Affordable Care Act premiums, if that's where they're getting their health care from. Clearly will put money into the pockets of people who are going to spend it. Clearly a boost to aggregate demand. David, do you have anything to add on that one?
It would certainly be an increase in aggregate demand. It's going to provide a greater incentive for people to actually get the insurance rather than, let's say, taking the penalty. Well, I think at this point, they don't even have the penalty.
Right.
Essentially, some of the political changes going on. But anything that helps to provide insurance for those with low incomes is going to be important because, if you handle a health issue right away, it tends to be far less costly than if you let a problem go on for years. And then you've got like big bills because now someone is in intensive care or is in the hospital for, months or years. The other thing is that it does have a provision for limiting increases in drug prices once a drug has been on the market for a decade. And that's going to be important in terms of keeping medication affordable. I just want to point out that some of these topics are being researched by faculty at the Feliciano School of Business. So we are a good source for leading edge information.
Absolutely. All right, a couple of more items, and then I want to get to the flip side of this coin, which is where's the money coming from? But a couple more items on the spending.
Yes.
$165 billion on healthcare spending. So I apologize. $150 billion to expand affordable home care and $150 billion for affordable housing. Let's take a look at the money being spent on affordable home care and how will that impact job creation?
Okay. Well, first of all, as a reminder for everyone, affordable home care typically deals with home care either for the very young or in most cases, the very old. Right. So if you've got grandparents or elder parents, many of them, instead of going to a hospice or going to a hospital,
right,
are trying to stay at home.
Right.
But they need some help. And that's where these healthcare providers come into play. And so the idea of having this affordable home care, one, it'll provide better compensation for these healthcare providers, which means there'll be a increased quantity supply of these providers. Now, why is this important? Because if older people, just by getting a little help, can stay at home, take care of themselves, and not have to be reliant on their children to take care of them, it makes it easier for their adult children to work and deal with the rest of their lives, which means that people will be able to be more productive and be able to be in the workforce more because they can substitute out of taking care of their elder parents to working in the workforce. So that's going to also have an improvement in aggregate supply.
Right. Excellent. Okay, now let's turn this coin over and look at the other side. So we're talking about $1.75 trillion worth of spending, most of it portioned out over a 10-year period. One of the things that the Democrats said was they were going to, quote unquote, pay for it, okay, with increased taxes. The Congressional Budget Office, which is nonpartisan, examined the bill, and they found that it will raise, that additional money will be raised to the tune of about 1.5 trillion, perhaps short by 250 billion, give or take, over 10 years. What are the main provisions that will, who's going to be paying higher taxes to pay for some of this spending?
Okay, so a couple of the main components. One, with respect to large corporations, and that is going to be defined as ones that generate $1 billion of profit a year or above. They'll have a minimum effective tax rate of 15%. So the idea, so we do know there are some major corporations, because of certain tax provisions, actually manage to get by paying very little taxes. So that's going to change. Another thing is that many companies in the last few years, because of all the easy money that's been available, have been performing stock buybacks. And while that's very nice for them to increase the price of the stock, which if you're a shareholder makes you happy, doesn't necessarily increase the productivity of the business. And so what they'll be doing is a 1% surcharge on companies that perform these stock buybacks. So some companies may still do that, but if they're spending a lot of money there, that's another 1% that'll go toward the U.S. Treasury. Another important element will be dealing with an additional income tax, extra income tax for those who are making $10 million a year or more. And depending
Hold on. David, are you worried about this personally?
Oh, we are on pause?
No, we're not on pause.
Oh,
we're not on pause.
Okay.
We're not worried about this.
Yeah.
So say that again. Say that again slowly. Say that again slowly. An extra income tax of 5% on who?
5 to 8% on those who are making $10 million or more a year.
And then if it's 5% on people who make more than 10 million, and an additional 3, so a total of 8% on income above 25 million.
Correct.
To put that in perspective, we're talking about raising taxes 5% on people who make more than 10 million and an additional 3% on people who make more than 25. Somewhere between 15 to 20,000 people in this country fall into this category. That is less than 1/100th of 1% of the people in this country. So we're talking about having the very wealthiest people in this country spend more in taxes to pay for this. We talk a lot in macroeconomics that we both teach about something called propensity to save and propensity to spend. Okay, taking money away from mega wealthy people in taxes. How are their spending habits different than people with lower incomes?
Well, one thing to keep in mind is that people with very high incomes also tend to have quite a bit of wealth. And when you're wealthy, your spending habits have almost nothing to do with the amount of income you make.
Okay.
Right. So what does that mean? It means that if you give someone wealthy an extra $10 million, they're not necessarily going to spend any more than they would have otherwise. Now, they may want to invest it so they can make more money on it. But if you give that same amount of money to, hundreds of thousands of families that are only making $20,000 a year, almost all of that is going to get spent by those in the lower income and certainly in the very low wealth brackets.
Right. So basically what this bill is doing, it's asking the very wealthiest Americans. We're not talking wealthy or very wealthy. We're talking the wealthiest Americans to spend an additional 5 to 10% of income. And there's something else I want to talk about in terms of wealth versus income.
Yes.
And that money, which was probably going to be invested, but almost certainly was not going to be consumed, is going to be turned into consumption, because it's going to be transferred to people with all these different parts of the bill with a much higher propensity to consume, which will result in much more aggregate demand, a lot more jobs to produce goods, perhaps slightly inflationary in terms of the upward pressure on prices when you have more aggregate demand. But again, a lot of the parts of the bill will free up labor to increase supply. There's just two parts. Clearly, this will be a help in terms of aggregate demand. But if aggregate supply also grows and perhaps grows faster, we'll have less downward, we won't have as much or any upward pressure on prices. Go ahead, David.
Yeah. So as a reminder to our listeners, many of these topics are being researched here at the Feliciano School of Business at Montclair State University. So we're delighted to talk with you, but everyone here is doing their part.
Also, I mean, this is what the subject of macroeconomics that we teach at several different levels for economics majors This is the nuts and bolts of it. What is the total demand of all the consumers and businesses and the government in this country? What is the supply, and how the aggregate demand and aggregate supply intersect to create a price level? Clearly, lots of parts of this bill is going to improve aggregate demand, increase spending, but it's also going to improve aggregate supply. And if the supply grows faster, and there are some people who analyzed the bill said it's going to be phenomenal in terms of increasing aggregate supply, you could end up with less inflationary pressure.
Yeah.
One thing that was good. Sorry, Dave, go ahead.
And one thing I want to add is that's also not always brought up. As you shift where the consumption spending predominantly is, if you shift it away from high income, wealthy families to lower income, that sends a signal to the market economy, right? That more should be produced for those who are poor and middle class. And again, if we end up with an increased supply, that could dampen some of the inflation for those in the low income ranges, which means life can be more affordable for them.
And then let's take another step further. Okay. So we're going to ask the very wealthiest to pay a little more. Who are the largest shareholders of Walmart? The Walmart family. They
Yes.
still own in the ballpark, I believe the Walmart family still owns in the ballpark of 50% of the company.
The Waltons?
The Waltons. Okay. When you give people with lower income more money, where are they most likely to spend it?
Places like Walmart.
And who's going to benefit?
The Walton family is going to make a lot of money off of this.
So taking money away from wealthy people, spending it and providing programs for poor people who then turn around and spend the money at the large places that are owned by wealthier people. That's what we talk about in terms of circular flow. When the money flows out, flows around, and comes back again. There's no question that this will be will provide a lot of support for large businesses just like Walmart and benefit people like the Walton family who will be asked to pay more. One item that was discussed during the creation of this bill, and it actually got a lot of press, but then it ended up being put on the shelf, was taxing wealth as opposed to income. Income is what you earn every year. Wealth is what you've accumulated over time. There are vast fortunes out on the west coast of this country. I'm specifically thinking about Silicon Valley and up in Seattle, Washington. Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, Google, Tesla. These are massive fortunes that have been accumulated by several thousand people to the tune of trillions of dollars. And the only time that these people pay taxes is when they sell part of their stock, and then they incur capital gains at substantially lower rates than income tax rates. Recently, Elon Musk went out on Twitter and said, should I sell $5 billion worth of stock? The vote came back yes, and he sold $5 billion, and he probably incurred a tax bill of about $1 billion. So it was proposed as part of a way to pay for something like this was to tax wealth, because there are vast fortunes that have been built up because of the stock market and because of the incredible gains made by technology companies. However, it was put on the shelf because the devil's in the details, and it's extremely complicated to figure out how to tax wealth.
Yes.
But meanwhile, there are many people who have benefited mostly from their own hard work and good fortune, but also these businesses that made all this money in technology was built on the backbone of the United States infrastructure. Our transportation systems, our communication systems, our infrastructure, which is now going to be getting a lot of help, which is just going to benefit them even more. And I think that this will be something that will be revisited by Congress again sometime in the future in terms of having to figure out a way to get those who've benefited massively without participating at all in terms of paying for it. So I think they're going to come back to that.
Yeah.
Alrighty.
If I may.
Yes, go ahead, David.
Yeah. So in terms of, something like a wealth tax, there's a number of moral and ethical issues come up. Some will argue that if you've already paid tax on your income, why are you getting, taxed again on your wealth?
That's correct.
On the other hand, we could also say, well, who benefits the most from, there being a strong United States government and particularly military? Well, we all benefit from being alive, but certainly those that are wealthiest get the most benefit from their wealth being protected.
Oh, they absolutely enjoy the protection of the courts and the military and the police. There's no question.
Right. So the challenge around a wealth tax then is this. They're likely to recognize the very wealthy they're not dumb. They know the benefits that they're receiving. That doesn't prevent them from wanting to negotiate to pay the lowest price for what they're getting. And part of how they negotiate is to influence politicians and laws. And so that's another way of understanding, what's going on.
I hear you. Okay. I think that basically wraps up our discussion over here. We are now waiting for the Senate to actually bring this up for a vote. We are here in early December. The Senate wants to get out of town for Christmas recess. The majority leader, Senator Chuck Schumer from New York, has said he wants to bring this to a vote before we go away for Christmas. But I haven't heard anything recently about when, in fact, it will show up for a vote. It is strongly anticipated that no Republican senator will vote for this.
Yeah.
Therefore, there are only 50 Democrat senators. There are two specifically who have voiced concerns, which is Kristen Sinema from Arizona and Joe Manchin from Virginia. Many of their concerns have already been addressed. There might be a few other points. So we look forward to seeing if this is actually going to come up to a vote before Christmas. And right now, because there are only 50 Democrat senators, they have to keep everybody in the fold and on the same page. So it'll be interesting to see how this gets modified. Almost everyone who studied the bill expects it to be modified in the Senate before it comes back finally up for a vote.
Yes. Yep.
Okay, that wraps up our discussion over here. I'm Todd Federman. I teach economics at the Feliciano School of Business at Montclair State.
And I'm David Axelrod. I also teach economics at Feliciano School of Business at Montclair State.
And we look forward to discussing more economic items in the news in the future. Take care.
Be well and enjoy the new year.